I've gone from a non-reader to regularly reading 1 to 2 books per week. So here is 11 incredibly specific and practical ways to actually create a reading habit that sticks. And these are the ones that I found that work for me. So first up, question your assumptions and rules around reading. I'm front loading this list with arguably the most important point rather than doing the typical online thing of arbitrarily building up the tension just to keep your attention. So just dip it in and out of this list and see what works for you. So if you're like me, you've learned to read at school, and it starts with learning to read as a skill, and then it becomes reading for enjoyment, but then quickly over time it becomes a study technique. And if we're not careful, then we can equate this act of reading with revising for a test, which essentially acts as proof of whether we understood the book or not. And that is so unbelievably harmful for so many people growing up because it puts this enormous amount of pressure, unnecessary pressure, on performing for a test, which then gets equated to our self-worth and our identity as well. So chances are, if you're watching this, you're an adult and you're no longer at school. There's no exam to study for. You're allowed to just read for enjoyment. You're allowed to read a book and not 100% memorize every single point inside of it. In fact, you can forget almost everything inside that book, but if you do something with even just one piece of that information, or simply enjoy reading for the sake of reading, then it wasn't a failure. And the conditioning from school around this can be so strong that it puts so many people off reading entirely as an adult. And I can say this quite confidently as someone who was taught in school for 10 years. So really, really practical question for you. What are your hidden assumptions or rules around reading, and what counts as successful reading? And how can you start to let go of some of them? So very closely related, we've got point 2. Don't get too comfortable. Everywhere I look online, everyone is maximizing coziness with all kinds of blankets and candles and drinks and whatever else. And that's lovely. It makes for a really great aesthetic, don't get me wrong. But if you're already tired and now you're getting super comfortable, there's a good chance to just fall asleep rather than actually read. And if the main block you've already got around reading is that you can't focus, then getting even more comfortable and cozier probably isn't going to benefit your focus levels. And as you'll find out, these rules are all very much what I found works for me. So take it with a pinch of salt, and by all means disagree. I'm just sharing some ideas that I don't often hear online, but that I've experimented with and have helped me. So for reference, I like to read at the kitchen table and sat upright, and I typically do most of my reading early in the morning. So around 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. are my best hours. But again, that's not practical every single day. So I want a flexible routine. So I'm going to pair points 3 and 4 together because they follow on from this. So point 3, reading is not just a mental activity. And point 4, go with the energy. And by that I mean heavy metal and standing up. So for me, reading is definitely a physical activity just as much as it is a mental activity. If I want to read in the afternoon, but I'm already feeling a bit tired, I definitely can't be sitting down to read because my concentration levels are absolutely not there whatsoever. Now, I'm a big fan of extremely heavy music, so quite often I'll also stand up and move around and do some stretching and have very heavy music playing just to keep my concentration up. Like I say, you probably won't find most of these strategies anywhere else because I've found them haphazardly through trial and error in terms of what actually works for me. But there's something special for me about listening to black metal and reading psychology and philosophy, especially in winter. So going back to point 1, question your assumptions around what reading looks like. It doesn't have to be lo-fi chill beats to study to whilst being under a blanket. It could be fully grown men screaming at you as well. All right, points 5, 6, and 7 are all going to be very closely related. So for point number 5, stop reading unrelated books and build a library instead. So think bigger than just the book that you are currently reading. Think about it in terms of how might this idea link to other ideas? What other authors write about similar themes? How do they, I'm running out of room here, how do they compare to each other? Because if you're reading for depth or self-discovery or inner work more broadly, it can help to have, for example, 5 books that all support one another rather than just reading 5 random books. And there's a little side tip here. If you really like one book, you can just go to the bibliography section and highlight all the books that pique your interest. So for example, I really liked Shadow, Self and Spirit. So what I did was I went to the bibliography, and I'll just show you on here what I did. So there was loads and loads of books that are referenced here. You can see we've got all this page, and so on. I really liked the points that was highlighted in this book, so I've highlighted it on here. In terms of the next part, again, nothing on here. But over here, I really like the look of this one, so I've highlighted that. And then over here, another one here, and another one on here. So I've got a couple of books to help take this idea further. So if you like an author, and that author has provided all of his sources, then there's a good chance that you'll understand them a lot more and in a deeper way if you see where they actually got their inspiration from. And that's a big part of my library building project as well on this channel. There's no gatekeeping of information. I'll tell you exactly where I found every single idea and how they link to other ideas. And I also encourage you to buy the books for yourselves and to read them as well. But there is an inevitable question here. That's great, but once I've built up the momentum, but how do I actually get started to begin with? And that's point 6. So that is read essay collections. Personally, I love doing this. So let me give you an example. I've got an interest in ecology and the climate, but I had absolutely no idea where to begin. And then in a local charity shop, I found this essay collection called Deep Ecology for the 21st Century. So I bought it and I spent about 2 weeks reading all of the essays inside of it. And I found the vast majority of them interesting. Some of them not so much, but there were also then in that a few essays which I absolutely loved. So what I did was I highlighted those, I checked the bibliography, and then I prioritized those books. So just as a quick little skim through here, you can see how much I've actually highlighted a book like this. And some essays have got loads of heavy highlights, some of them have got none, basically whatsoever. So in particular, I really liked the essays by a man called Anna. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Spelled like this anyway. So what I did was I prioritized his work, and then I found one of his books online for £5.42. And then what I did was I don't overthink the process. I just go broad with the idea of an essay collection, and then I narrow in on my favorite essays to see where they come from and those authors. And then I prioritize buying those books because my interest is already there. So there's a good chance I'm going to enjoy a book like this. And if you're wondering how I remember that ecology, community and lifestyle cost me exactly £5.42, well, that's point 7. Log everything and track the books as well. Now, I keep a spreadsheet of every single book that I've read, the page numbers, where I bought it, the costs, and everything else like that. Now, you don't need to be that pedantic about it, but I personally quite like to look over all of this data. And it's a little obsessive tendency of mine, and I'm just going to lean into it. So I've found that I'm more likely to keep up the consistency and the momentum with a habit if I track it and if I monitor it, which is also what I do for running, and I've previously done that for weightlifting as well. So there's also bonus points for when you meet another reader. You can out-obsess them by sending them a ridiculously thorough PDF or spreadsheet, which definitely proves how cool you are. It's always conditionally formatted as well, obviously. But point 8, while we're here, you've probably noticed this one already. Write in your books and make them your own. So with this, I use 4 things that I rely on basically all the time. 2 highlighters is the first point. So personally, I find it more useful and enjoyable to break down big sections of text into different colours. It just makes it easier to scan over them. For the second point, I use asterisks quite a lot. So if there's a point that stands out that I like, I make it clear with a little asterisk. For the third point, that's key points. If there's a really defining point that I know I need to learn or that summarises that chapter or that learning very well, I put KP in a circle, which stands for key point. I only do a handful of these per book, so if I want to quickly jump back in, I know exactly where I'm looking. And then the last thing, I just write sometimes beautiful or beautiful points. So sometimes I just really like how an author words something, so I just simply write out the word beautiful in that case. I don't necessarily do anything with that information, except appreciate how well it's worded. And realistically, that's all I do annotation-wise. So moving on, point 9, set a bronze, silver and a gold target. So this goes back to point 1 around the expectations and the rules again. So overall, the goal is to become a reader, not necessarily read this book or that book. So to get the initial momentum, rather than success versus failure, or yes I read versus no I didn't, it can be quite useful to have a wider range of success criteria. So for example, for me, this can be useful for bronze, silver, and gold. So let's say gold, for example, if I write that out on here, that might be something like read 50 pages or read for an hour. If we're thinking about something like silver, that might be to read 30 pages or to read for half an hour. And then I would set a considerably lower target for bronze. So I'll separate it out like this. And that might be something like sit with a book in front of me for 15 minutes or attempt to read even when I don't feel like it. Now, I don't do this so much nowadays, but it really did help me initially because gold and silver, they can be tracked very easily, whereas bronze is a lot more focusing on the inner attitude towards reading and something that I'm directly in control of rather than the external success, let's say, of gold and silver. Essentially, try to move away from this idea of black and white thinking of reading versus non-reading and widen that potential success criteria. And number 10, reread the best parts of the books or the best parts of the best books. So that is checking the contents page. Maybe this is just me, but when I think about my favorite albums, I've listened to them countless times. I've seen my favorite films 4 or 5 times as well. But when it comes to reading my favorite books, it's just once, maybe sometimes twice for special ones. So I'm currently moving towards this idea of rereading a lot of my favorite books and at the very least, rereading my favorite parts of the best books. So, for example, with this, let me just turn to the contents page just to show you what I'm referring to. Put that on the screen. So, I like finishing a book and then going back over the contents page to highlight my favorite chapters, so then I know on a return reading what to focus on and what to prioritize over all of them. So if I've not got time to read 300 pages, I know, for example, in this book, these 2 stood out to me. And again, it's a much more focus on the process of reading rather than the outcome, and then how I can build systems around reading rather than hyper optimizing how much information I actually extract from a book. And there is one point that underpins literally all of this, and that's the experimentation mindset. Or another way of saying that is have a scientific or a playful or a curious or a creative mindset to reading. So I try to work from the bottom up and not the top down. And that it's not just about copying others, but it's more about considering yourself a reader based on like what actually works for you rather than just emulating someone else's style. You don't want to be creating a routine for a human in general, but instead for you specifically. So give yourself permission to be wrong or to try things that you think at first might seem a bit strange or ridiculous or not very reader-esque. So just know that somewhere, no matter what your reading habit is going to look like, there's a man walking around a room listening to extremely heavy metal whilst reading philosophy and psychology, and he's just doing it for fun, even if you can barely remember what most of the points are half the time. So if I can do it, you can do it. You've just got to make the routine work for you. Is there anything extremely specific that you have found works for you? And if you want to let me know, by all means do. I'll do my best to not judge you, but I'm not promising anything. Right, that's my ridiculously specific list of ideas for you, and I will see you again in the future for a future lesson. See you then.